Hello, in this talk I will be presenting our research on can closed-ended practice testing promote understanding from text. Testing students on to-be-learned materials can be an effective learning activity that enhances retention relative to other comparison conditions such as rereading. Widely replicated in the literature, this effect is also known as the testing effect. In the literature, the basic paradigm being used looks as follows. Students will first study a set of materials, then either take a practice test or have an opportunity for a restudy before taking a final test. When the goal is to improve retention, there is good evidence that retrieval practice can reliably do so. Testing effects have been found across different sets of materials, tend to be robust over time, and even when initially during practice retrieval success is low, are still present. Does the type of test matter? We already know that some practice tests are more effective than others. Generally, the effectiveness of practice testing seems to increase along with the degree of elaboration that such test requires. In terms of question type and format, it has been found that generative, open-ended practice tests are more effective than cued recall or recognition tests. Now, for closed-ended testing formats such as true-false and multiple choice, there is some concern that they only prompt superficial processing. But can they improve learning? To start to answer this question, there are a few studies that offer preliminary evidence, and I will describe those next. The first one of these studies was conducted by Little et al. In 2012. In this study, participants read two texts about different science topics, and following an initial study period, then completed either a multiple choice or cued recall test on one passage and no test on the other. Following a 5-minute distractor task, all participants then completed a final cued recall assessment. What they found here was that both multiple choice practice as well as cued recall practice enhanced final test performance for the practice items relative to the no test condition. Importantly, in this study, the final test not only consisted of items previously tested during practice, but also some unpracticed items. While multiple choice practice testing did improve final test performance also for the previously unpracticed items, when compared to the no test condition, cued recall did not. Now, it is important to point out that the multiple choice practice test did include some competitive alternatives amongst its answer choices, and it was those items that were tested as unpracticed items on the final test. For true-false practice testing, there too is some evidence that it can improve learning from text. In a study very similar to the one by Little et al., Brabeck and colleagues used the very same materials, except for that they presented the practice test in a true-false testing format. For some participants, true-false practice testing was compared to no test immediately after only a 5-minute delay. For other participants, the final test was not presented until after 48 hours had passed. Compared to no test, true-false practice testing improved final test performance for both practiced and unpracticed items, both immediately and after the 48-hour delay. However, in this study, they also included a restudy group. In the graph on the right, you can see overall final test performance of the practice testing group and the restudy group side by side. Here, when true-false practice testing was compared to restudy, then the benefits of practice testing actually disappeared. In other words, in this study, true-false practice testing was no more effective than simply restudying the materials. To summarize past research, Little et al. Found that compared to no test, multiple choice practice testing was effective at improving final test performance. Likewise, Brabeck et al. Found that compared to no test, true-false practice testing improved final test performance both immediately and after a 48-hour delay. However, when they compared true-false practice testing to restudy, they did not find such benefit. While both studies claim to have shown transfer to unpracticed items, these unpracticed items were actually included as competitive alternatives during practice, and as such, not really new to the learner. Also, both of these studies did focus on memory and not understanding from text. As such, our question was, can closed-ended practice tests such as multiple choice and true-false also support better comprehension outcomes? To date, most of the practice testing literature has focused on memory, but not comprehension outcomes. Here it is important to point out what is the differences between retention and comprehension. To remember what a text said is not the same as having understood it. In terms of Kinch's comprehension framework, memory or retention are captured by the surface form and text space of a text. That is all that which is explicitly stated. However, when the goal is to have comprehension, then the reader must construct a situation model for the text. That is, not only remember the facts as they were originally presented, but be able to identify how they are connected within the text and also be able to use that information. So, is there evidence for that practice testing can improve comprehension? Yes, there is. Open-ended practice tests have been found to improve comprehension outcomes, but how questions engage the learner is also important. Generally, more constructive processing is what leads to better comprehension outcomes. For example, past research has demonstrated that having students engage in activities like writing explanations is more effective than just asking them to free recall the text. Now, by definition, closed-ended questions such as true, false, or multiple choice do not require the learner to generate an answer, and as such, it seems that opportunities for constructive processing are limited if non-existing. So, a big concern is that closed-ended questions may not prompt the type of processing that will improve comprehension outcomes. The goal of the present study was to examine whether closed-ended practice tests have any direct benefits on comprehension outcomes. It is possible that practice testing will also have some indirect benefits. Taking a practice test after reading may help students to better monitor their learning and diagnose what they do and do not know. Monitoring accuracy is typically assessed by asking students to make judgments of learning or comprehension. The accuracy of their judgment depends on the kind of cues that they're using to base their judgments on. So why do we think that practice testing will be beneficial? Well, when a testing activity precedes a judgment, this is something that learners can use as the basis for their judgments. Past research has demonstrated that judgments of learning made after a test tend to be more accurate than those made before. In the literature, this is also known as the post-diction superiority effect. For the present study, we had 3 guiding research questions. The first is focused on the direct benefits of practice testing. Can closed-ended practice tests support better comprehension outcomes? The second is focused on the indirect benefits of practice testing. Can closed-ended practice tests improve metacomprehension accuracy? And then finally, if so, are there differences between multiple choice and true-false testing formats? To these questions, this is the design of our study. This study was administered fully online in 2 parts. For part 1, participants would read 3 texts on different science topics, and then be randomly assigned to one of 3 conditions: multiple choice practice testing, true-false practice testing, or a restudy condition. They would complete this practice activity for all 3 texts, and then following this activity, they would also make a judgment of comprehension. That is, they would be asked to rate how well they think they understood each passage on a scale of 0 to 5. Part 2 was administered after a 2-day delay. For part 2, participants were asked to write 3 separate essays explaining how and why each of the 3 scientific phenomena occur. These essays were scored for 5 key concepts included in participants' mental model. We hand-scored these essays, and we also compared participant responses to an ideal model answer using latent semantic analysis. Because for our study, we were interested in comprehension outcomes, for our practice test, we only used inference questions. What is meant by that, I will illustrate here. On the left, you see your traditional memory question. For this question, the answer is explicitly stated in the text, as you can see highlighted in yellow. In contrast, for the inference question on the right, which is designed to test understanding from text, the learner has to use the information highlighted in green to make a reasonable inference over which of the answer choices seems to be most appropriate given what is stated in the text. Here you can see what the multiple choice versus true-false questions look like side by side. As you can see, for each of the response options for the multiple choice question, we created a matching true-false statement. For some of these statements, we did have to modify the wording slightly so that the number of true versus false items would be balanced on the true-false test. Also, note that between multiple choice and true-false questions, there are differences. Namely, while for multiple choice, the learner must only recognize which they think is the best answer out of the answer options provided, for true-false questions, they must evaluate each statement independently. These are the outcome measures that we calculated to examine our research question. To assess the direct effects of closed-ended practice testing, we compared the three conditions on the basis of their mean comprehension scores. This is simply the proportion out of 5 key concepts that participants included in their responses. To look at the indirect effects of practice testing, we computed 2 metacomprehension measures. One is overconfidence, which is simply the judgment of comprehension minus the actual final test score, and then the other is relative accuracy, which is the intra-individual correlation between judgments of comprehension and final test scores. That is looking at how well can learners differentiate in their learning between the different topics that they studied. Here's what we found. Both true-false and multiple-choice practice tests improved final test performance over that of the restudy group. Between the two practice testing formats, there was no difference in terms of which one was more effective. For indirect effects of practice testing, we also found that both multiple choice and true-false practice did significantly reduce participants' overconfidence in their understanding. For relative accuracy, however, between group differences were not significant. Closed-ended practice testing can improve comprehension outcomes. Both true-false and multiple-choice practice testing conditions outperformed a restudy control. Including this restudy group was important to show that benefits from practice testing were not merely re-exposure effects. Also, benefits of our practice test were robust over time, given that our final test was not administered until after a 2-day delay. Finally, it's encouraging to see that our benefits from practice testing transferred to a final test with all new questions. Closed-ended practice testing can also improve metacomprehension. As predicted, we did find evidence for post-diction superiority effects. Both true-false and multiple-choice practice significantly reduced participants' overconfidence in their understanding and led to more accurate judgments of comprehension. As such, practice testing with closed-ended questions may also promote more effective future study. For relative accuracy, we did not find significant effects, but we only have 3 texts in this current study. Most studies that do find differences due to manipulations tend to use larger sets of text. Finally, in terms of question type format, we did not find differences between true-false and multiple-choice practice tests in terms of either comprehension or metacomprehension outcomes. So you might be wondering if there already is evidence that practice testing with open-ended questions can improve comprehension. Well, why do we care about closed-ended tests? The answer to that is quite simple. Despite the fact that benefits of practice testing have been well and widely documented, some educators are still not willing to implement these practices, citing reasons such as there not being enough time or that grading and administering these tests is just too complicated. Now, with closed-ended tests, there is a big advantage over the open-ended alternatives in the sense that generally they're easier to construct and administer, easier to grade, and also easier to give feedback on. Here's good news. It does seem that practice testing with closed-ended questions can support both comprehension and transfer. And it also seems that the usefulness of different types of questions may be less dependent on format, but rather in how these questions engage the learner. In the future, more research is still needed on how to best support constructive processing with closed-ended question formats. Thank you so much for attending our talk, and please feel free to contact us with any questions or comments.